Okay. So my presentation today is going to be really trying to see how we could use the like paleoecological data in terms of its application, and that for us to be able to build the legacy of ERICS over time. So I'm gonna present some evidence from the response of the vegetation and also the human livelihoods from the semi-arid area in Madagascar. So in Africa, we are much like been affected with climate change, and that is already like recorded throughout different sectors, and even projection for Africa to future climate change has suggested that various areas would be mostly impacted. And this requires us to have like a proper adaptation strategies in response to this climate change. But also this is in a context where most human population in the African continent is still depending on natural resources. And this often creates a conflict between conservation practices and strategies and the development of this population, which needs further research to be solved. So using the case of forager communities that lives in the southwest of Madagascar, they are called Mikea, I would try to demonstrate on how we could use like multiple proxies and help in those circumstances and in those like complex issues as well. So for this area in Southwest Madagascar occupied by these communities, there is a known decrease in rainfall in the area, and specifically during the 14th century, there is like a significant wet period in the area. And then during the 20th century, there is a dry period in the area and associated with the decreasing. So those communities are experiencing some issues, especially since the decision to put a protected area within their area of occupation has arisen in 2012. And this was based mostly on the assumption that there was an increase in fire within the forest, in the Mikea forest. And so they were given mostly two choices. Like the first one would be that they could stay in the park, but only if they practice foraging. However, some research has shown that there has been significantly decrease in terms of resources of food within the forest, and living with that would not help these communities. And then the second option that they were given is that they can move to the buffer zone of the park where they could conduct other activities. And this can lead to different land conflict with other ethnicities that are living in the area. So these communities are facing different various challenges, and that leads to complexities in terms of environmental management, but also in terms of their development themselves. So we wanted to investigate how they have adapted their livelihood to the like the dry periods that's occurring in the area. To see if fire has increased in their area and how was the vegetation during this period, specifically during the wettest period and the dry period. So we used like some of the standard proxies, which I'm not going to spend too much time on. But basically, we investigated during the 14th century, looked at the change in vegetation, change in fire, and change in herbivory activities. And similarly, during the 20th century. So during those two periods, like most of the mega herbivores that occurred in Madagascar were already extinct, and so like an increase in spores, coprophilous spores would indicate like mostly association with pastoralism activities conducted by this, the communities living around this area. And so our spore results suggested that during the 14th century, there are practically very low spore concentration in the area. And then when we get to the 20th century, there is this massive increase. So as I mentioned earlier, during the 14th centuries, most of the mega herbivores were already extinct. And it is the period where that was suggested to be the arrival of pastoralism in the area, which might suggest the slight presence of spores during this 14th century. But then when we get to the 20th century, there is this massive increase in spores, which is associated to the practice of pastoralism by some of the Smithia forest, but also by other ethnicities who brings their cattle within the Mikia forest. And in terms of fire, we have seen that there is, in terms of micro charcoal, there is a pretty a higher rate of micro charcoal during the 14th century compared to macro charcoal. And this is this was associated to the arrival of pastoralism, but also the settlements of different ethnicities within the area. But what strikes us is the results of the macro charcoal that occurred during the 20th century, which is mostly it increased, but then it stayed at a more stable, steady pace during the whole century. And this is in correlation with the current practices conducted by these communities, where they have an annual cycle of livelihoods, where at certain time of the year, they would cultivate maize and cassava, and it's where they burn the fields and some section of the fields to do their seasonal cultivation. And so we looked also at the vegetation. We had about 68 taxa that we found, but like mostly the major changes in the pollen results was the increase in xerophytic. So the vegetation within the area was a wooded savanna, with the 14th century dominated by a palm pandanus, and the 20th century with a massive increase in xerophytic taxa, dry adapted taxa, as you can see in the orange graph at the bottom here, which suggested a response to the dry period, but also an increase in some of the herbaceous taxa that are associated to disturbance mostly. So if I summarize what happened within this period, like the wet and dry period, we could see that there was changes during the wet period. People, the communities, the forager communities were mostly living with foraging because the low fire and low herbivory activities that we recorded, and the vegetation was already like a savanna ecosystem. And then during the dry periods, there is the increase of fire, which was associated to the seasonal practice of agriculture by these communities, but also the increase in herbivory activities, which is associated to the pastoralism practiced by some of these forager communities and also other ethnicities, pastoralists that lived within the region. But still, the foraging of activities of these communities were still maintained within this period. So we had to think of the scenarios, like what would happen considering the decisions in terms of management of the park within the area occupied by these communities. So one scenario would be that within the changes in rainfall in the area, if these communities remained in the park and they are integrated with the management of the park, then they would be able to maintain their foraging activities, which was suggested to be more beneficial for them than conducting other activities. And with that, we could also participate in maintaining the cultural heritage, but also the conservation of the biodiversity within this area. On the other hand, if they are excluded with the park, and if they decide to go outside of the park to conduct their activities, they would potentially shift to the practice of agropastoralism, meaning more clearing of lands, and that would lead to the loss of biodiversity within the area, but also a competition with other ethnicities that are living in the area, and in the long run, insecurity and also conflicts, not only with biodiversity and development, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but also within the communities living in these areas. So I hope that through my talk today, I've shown that the importance of how we have to integrate like the communities within the conservation or management at the different parts in Africa, and shown also the necessity of having long-term investigation, interdisciplinary investigation, and also the increase of collaboration within African scientists, which would allow us to have like a more higher special scale coverage, but also different case studies, which I think could be facilitated by the African pollen database. And through that, we could keep Eric's legacy and elaborate like a wider collaboration. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. That's really cool work. We probably do actually have time for a question if we have any from the audience, either for Estelle or for Liddy if you had questions at the end of her talk. So if you have a question for either of them, feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute. Oh, was someone trying to talk? I couldn't tell. Okay, so I actually had a quick question for you, Estelle. Oh, Simon has a question that he just put in the chat, which was similar to one that I was going to ask. And so the question is, how does this translate into policy? Sort of what's the next step, I guess?
So for now, so we tried to, so this paper is just published. And then we tried to like contact some of other of the policymakers in Madagascar so that we could put this forward, but also we are hoping to organize a workshop with all the stakeholders that are working in the area soon, hopefully with the COVID situation.
I just wanted to follow up to say I turned on my microphone, but there was loud traffic noise outside. That was an amazing talk. It was super cool. I loved it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, is there good communication between like researchers and the policymakers that are thinking about management strategies within the park? I was curious about that as well.
So I mean, like at this stage, it's not really established yet. But what like I'm trying to do with other colleagues is that we would try to reach out to the people that are managing like specifically the area where we're working on, and then try to interact with them on a regular basis. Like, this is what we find, how do you guys are doing, kind of thing. So like, it's not really like within the, I would say like the management, the general governmental side, but like I would know someone working in for example, in this park, and then I would interact with them, like trying to build a relationship with them and then communicate with them. Like, this is what we've seen. How would you be able to do this? So it's kind of like a evolving process, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's cool to see the paleoecological data then like translate into practice. So that's really exciting. Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.